The old rifle had been a constant presence in Clara's life for as long as she could remember. It wasn't just a tool for hunting or a dusty relic hung over a mantel. It was the physical embodiment of her family's story. The wood of the stock, a dark oil-stained walnut, was worn smooth in places from the grip of her grandfather's hands, then her father's, and now her own. The metal of the barrel, though blued with age, still held a faint sheen. To anyone else, and it might have looked like a piece of junk, an outdated bolt-action .22 that belonged in a museum. To Clara, it was a compass pointing back to everything she loved and had lost. Her grandfather, a quiet man with eyes the color of a winter sky, had taught her father to shoot with it, just as her father had taught her. She could still picture her dad, his large, calloused hands gently guiding her small fingers to the right spot on the trigger, his voice a low rumble in her ear. Breath in, and let it out slow and squeeze. Don't pull, let the shot surprise you. Those lessons in the crisp autumn fields behind their small farmhouse were more than just marksmanship. They were lessons in patience, in stillness, in the connection between intention and action. The rifle was a testament to that legacy, a bridge between generations. After her father passed away, the rifle became a silent anchor for Clara. She was adrift in a world that suddenly felt too big and too empty. The farm, now which had always hummed with her father's life, fell quiet. The silence was deafening. While her mother threw herself into work in town to keep them afloat, Clara found herself drawn to the old gun safe. She would take the rifle out, not to shoot it, but just to hold it. She'd run her fingers over the minor dings and scratches in the stock, each one a chapter in a story she could almost remember being told. A shallow gouge from when her father had propped it against a barbed wire fence as a boy, and a dark stain from where her grandfather had rested it on a dewy log at dawn. The rifle was a time machine, and holding it made her feel closer to the two men who had shaped her world. It was in this state of quiet grief that she started her senior year at Millbrook High School. Moving to a new town had been the plan before her dad got sick, and after he was gone, the plan remained, a numb, autopilot decision made by her mother to be closer to family. Clara was the new girl, and the quiet girl from the country who wore second-hand boots and didn't know how to do her makeup like the popular girls. She was an easy target. The leader of the pack was a boy named Derek Thorpe, a senior with a thick wallet, a loud laugh, and a pack of sycophants who laughed whenever he did. He was the kind of person who measured his own worth by the misery he could inflict on others. The first few weeks were a slow burn of casual cruelty, derisive snickers in the hallway when she walked by, a deliberately tripped foot in the cafeteria, sending her tray clattering to the floor, a nasty nickname, Swamp Girl, that stuck because Derek had decided it was funny. Clara learned to make herself small, to keep her head down, to navigate the hallways like a soldier moving through hostile territory. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself that in a few months she would graduate and leave this place and its petty king and his court of fools far behind. She had her memories. She had the quiet evenings at home, holding the old rifle, finding a strange, solitary peace. One day, her mother, seeing her so withdrawn and lonely, gently suggested she try to connect with her new surroundings. "Maybe you could join a club, honey? Or have some friends over? It might be nice." The idea seemed so foreign to Clara. Friends? Over? To what? Show them the old farmhouse that smelled of dust and wood smoke? But the suggestion planted a seed. Her only real connection to her old life, to her father, was the rifle. Maybe sharing a small part of that history could be a way to bridge the gap between her two worlds. It was a naive, desperate hope. The next day, a few of her classmates in history class were talking about a local museum exhibit on pioneer life. They seemed genuinely interested. For a fleeting, foolish moment, Clara felt a spark. She could contribute. She had something real from that era. So, later that day in the cafeteria, she saw an opportunity. A girl in her art class, Maya, was sitting alone, sketching in a notebook. Clara gathered her courage and sat down opposite her. They talked about the sketching, about art. And then, haltingly, Clara mentioned the rifle. She didn't brag. She just told Maya about its history, about her grandfather and father, how it was passed down. Maya listened, her eyes showing genuine interest. For the first time since arriving, Clara felt a tiny flicker of connection. She felt seen for something other than her cheap clothes or her quietness. It was a fragile, precious thing, and she guarded it carefully. What Clara didn't notice was that a few tables over, Derek had been watching. He wasn't interested in Maya or her art. He was a predator, always scanning for weakness, for something to exploit. He saw the new girl, the quiet one he'd already marked, leaning in and speaking with an unusual intensity to another student. He saw a secret, and in Derek's world, other people's secrets were weapons. He leaned over to Kyle, his thick-necked shadow. "See that? Swamp Girl's got something to say. Let's find out what." A cruel smile played on his lips as he plotted his next move, a move that would shatter Clara's fragile peace and bring her father's legacy into the crosshairs of his casual, devastating cruelty. The rumor started like a slow poison, seeping through the cracks of the high school's social structure. Clara first noticed the looks changing. And it wasn't just dismissal anymore. It was a new kind of curiosity, laced with mockery. Whispers followed her down the hall, cutting off abruptly when she turned around. She heard a fragment one day, floating on the air from a group of giggling girls. "Some old gun? Like for real?" Her stomach clenched. Maya must have told someone else, and that person had told another, and the story had twisted in the telling. It was no longer a family heirloom with a touching story, and it was Swamp Girl's creepy old gun, a weird prop in the drama of her otherness. Derek was the maestro of this orchestra of whispers. He'd strategically drop comments within earshot of Clara. "Ever held a rifle, Swamp Girl, or is it just for show? You hunt squirrels with it? Fitting." His cronies, Kyle and Brett, would snort with laughter, adding their own crude jokes. Clara tried to ignore them, to wrap herself in a cloak of invisibility, but their words were like stones, each one chipping away at her composure. She stopped talking to Maya, not out of anger, but out of a deep, weary resignation. The attempt at connection had backfired spectacularly, handing her tormentors the very tool they would use against her. The rifle, her source of comfort, had become a liability, a target. The whispers escalated into direct, public humiliation. One afternoon, as Clara was walking to her locker, Derek and his group fell into step beside her. "So, Clara," Derek said, in his voice loud enough for everyone in the bustling hallway to hear, "we heard you've got a piece, an antique, a real family treasure." He stretched the last word out, making it sound absurd. "We were thinking," he continued, ignoring her stony silence, "you should show us. Bring it to school. We're all dying to see it. Right, guys?" His friends nodded, grinning like hyenas. Clara's face flushed. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's not for show." Derek's eyes narrowed. Not for show? Come on, don't be selfish. Share with the class." His laughter was a sharp, cruel bark that seemed to echo down the corridor. The bell rang, a merciful reprieve, and Clara ducked into her classroom, her hands trembling. She tried to convince herself it was just talk. They were bullies. They thrived on threats and posturing. They wouldn't actually do anything. But a deep, primal part of her, the part that had learned to read the woods and the weather, knew better. She saw the obsessive glint in Derek's eye. He wasn't just trying to scare her. He was on a mission. Her rejection in the hallway had been a challenge, and his ego wouldn't allow him to back down. Her peaceful home, her only sanctuary, suddenly felt vulnerable. The rifle was there, in the gun safe in her father's old study. The thought of them finding it, of their grubby hands on the smooth wood her father had touched, filled her with a cold dread. A few days later, Clara's mother had to work a late shift at the county hospital's administrative office. Clara was alone. She was in the kitchen, making a simple dinner, when she heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. It was too deliberate, too slow to be her mother's car. A spike of adrenaline shot through her. She moved silently to the living room window, peering through a gap in the curtains. Her heart stopped. An expensive SUV was parked in the driveway, its engine idling. 4 figures were walking towards the house. Even in the fading light, she recognized the confident, swaggering gait of Derek Thorpe. Behind him were Kyle, Brett, and a girl she recognized from Derek's group, a sneering blonde named Tiffany. Her first instinct was to freeze, to hide. But a stronger instinct, a surge of protective fury, propelled her into action. She ran to her father's study. Her hands, clumsy with fear, fumbled with the combination lock on the gun safe. And the numbers were burned into her memory. Her father's birthday. The lock clicked open. She grabbed the rifle, her grandfather's rifle, her father's rifle. It felt cold and heavy in her hands. She had no ammunition for it. It hadn't been fired in years. But it was a presence, a tangible piece of her defenders. She held it close as she heard the pounding on the front door. It wasn't a knock. It was a demand. "Hey, Swamp Girl, open up! We know you're in there! We just want to see it!" Derek's voice was muffled but unmistakable, filled with the arrogant certainty that he could take whatever he wanted. Clara didn't answer. She backed into the corner of the study, clutching the rifle, praying they would just go away. The pounding continued, mixed with laughter. Then came a sickening crack of wood splintering. They had broken the old lock on the front door. She heard the door swing open and the thud of their feet on the wooden floor of her home. And they were inside. They were in her sanctuary. They were stomping through the space that still held the echo of her father's voice. A cold, clear thought crystallized in her mind. They weren't just bullies anymore. They were invaders, and she was the only one left to defend the fort. The sounds of the invasion were a cacophony of destruction. She heard a lamp crash to the floor in the living room. A drawer was pulled out and dumped, its contents scattering. "Where do you keep it?" Clara?" Derek's voice rang out, a twisted sing-song. "Don't make us tear the whole place apart." The footsteps drew closer, moving down the hallway. Tiffany's high-pitched giggle cut through the air. "This place is so gross. It smells like old people." Rage, hot and bright, began to melt the ice of fear in Clara's veins. This was her home, her history, her life, and they were desecrating it for sport. The footsteps stopped right outside the study door. The door handle rattled. It was locked. At a moment of silence, then a heavy shoulder slammed against the wood. The old door shuddered but held. Another slam. Another. On the third, the frame splintered and the door burst open, crashing against the wall. Derek stood in the doorway, a triumphant smirk plastered on his face. Kyle and Brett loomed behind him, and Tiffany peered over their shoulders, her expression a mix of boredom and anticipation. For a second, Derek's smirk faltered. He saw Clara, backed into the corner, but he also saw the rifle. It was pointed at the floor, but it was in her hands. The sight of it, a real gun, gave him a momentary pause. Then he recovered. "Well, well," he said, his voice regaining its oily confidence. "Look what we have here. The little swamp rat found her little pea-shooter." He stepped into the room, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "Hand it over, Clara. We just want to see it." "Get out of my house," Clara said, her voice shaking but clear. Then her knuckles were white on the rifle's stock. "Or what?" Derek laughed, stepping closer. You gonna shoot me? With that old thing? I bet it doesn't even work. He turned to his friends, appealing to his audience. She's all talk, guys. A freak with a fossil. Kyle and Brett laughed on cue, a hollow, nervous sound. Emboldened by their laughter, Derek took another step forward, his hand outstretched. Come on, give it. This is pathetic. As he reached for the barrel, Clara pulled back. But it was too late. His fingers closed around the cool metal. For a microsecond, their eyes met. His were full of contempt. Hers were full of fear. Then, with a sharp, triumphant yank, he tore the rifle from her grasp. The moment the rifle left her hands, a piece of Clara's soul went with it. She felt utterly hollowed out. Derek held it up, examining it like a curious artifact. Wow, look at this piece of junk, he sneered. It's all scratched up. Wood's all worn. Your family must have been really poor to have to use this. He held it out to Kyle, who took it with clumsy hands. They passed it back and forth, mocking its weight, its age. Tiffany wrinkled her nose. It smells like dust and old people, she repeated her earlier sentiment. Please, Clara whispered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. Please, just leave it. Leave my house. I won't tell anyone. Her plea was the fuel they needed. It confirmed their power. Derek took the rifle back from Brett. He hefted it in his hands, a thoughtful, cruel expression on his face. He looked at Clara, then at his friends, then back at the rifle. He saw not an object of sentimental value, but a symbol of everything he hated, the strange, the quiet, the things that didn't bow to him. He wanted to destroy it, to erase it, to prove that his world of expensive cars and loud laughter was the only one that mattered. You know what, Clara? He said, then his voice dropping to a mock conspiratorial whisper. I think it's time for this old relic to retire, for good. With a sudden, violent movement, he swung the rifle like a baseball bat, smashing the stock against the edge of her father's old oak desk. The crack of splitting wood was sickeningly loud in the small room. Clara screamed, a raw, visceral sound that was torn from her throat. It was a sound of pure anguish. Derek grinned, a wild, manic look in his eyes. Break it! He yelled. He swung again, this time aiming for the barrel. The metal clanged against the desk's iron leg. Kyle, catching the fever, grabbed the rifle from Derek. He stomped on the stock, the weakened wood snapping further. Brett joined in, laughing as they took turns destroying it. They wrenched the bolt action, bending it. They snapped the thin barrel, now just a piece of worthless pipe. They threw the pieces against the wall, watching them clatter to the floor. Tiffany just watched, her initial boredom replaced by a detached, almost clinical fascination. Clara watched, frozen, as her family's history was systematically demolished before her eyes. She saw her grandfather's patient hands, her father's gentle guidance, all the quiet autumn afternoons, all the lessons of a lifetime being smashed into splinters on the floor. The tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. She didn't make a sound after that first scream. She just watched. I'd a hollow statue in the corner of the room, as the last tangible piece of her father was torn apart by strangers. When they were done, the floor was littered with broken wood and twisted metal. The rifle that had spanned 3 generations was nothing but debris. Derek, breathing heavily from his exertion, looked around at the wreckage with satisfaction. He turned to Clara, his chest still heaving. There, he said, his voice flat. All better. Now you don't have to worry about that old thing anymore. He gestured to his friends. Come on, let's get out of this dump. They filed out of the study, their footsteps receding down the hall. Clara heard the front door creak open, then slam shut. The sound of the SUV's engine roared to life, then faded into the night. Silence descended on the farmhouse. It was a different kind of silence than the one that had followed her father's death. That silence had been full of grief, a heavy, a sorrowful quiet. This silence was empty. It was the silence of a tomb. Clara stood in the middle of the study, surrounded by the physical remains of her legacy. She didn't move for a long time. She just stared at the pieces on the floor, the broken stock, the bent barrel, the shattered scope her father had mounted years ago. The farmhouse felt colder than it ever had before. The sanctuary was violated. The legacy was gone. And in the hollow space where her grief and love had lived, something new began to grow. It was small and cold and hard as iron. It was a quiet, implacable resolve. The destruction was complete, but in its wake, it had cleared the ground for something else to take root. The days that followed the destruction of the rifle were a blur of gray, mechanical motion for Clara. She went to school because that's what you did. She sat in class, stared at the board, and heard nothing. The whispers had evolved from mockery into a kind of awed, whispered legend. And the story of the break-in had mutated into something else, something that painted her as either a victim deserving of scorn or a weirdo who got what was coming to her. Derek and his crew gave her a wide berth, but their smirks were more triumphant than ever. They had won. They had crushed her. The proof was in her shattered posture, her hollow eyes. Clara's mother was devastated, not just by the break-in, but by the look in her daughter's eyes. They filed a police report, of course. A sympathetic officer came by, took notes, looked at the destroyed rifle, and promised to look into it. But without witnesses, without any evidence beyond Clara's word against 4 popular kids, the case went nowhere. The officer's apologetic shrug said it all. It was a juvenile matter, a he said, she said. The Thorpe family's lawyer probably had it squashed before the ink on the report was dry. The system, designed for justice, was impotent against the casual, a protected cruelty of small-town privilege. Clara retreated completely. She stopped trying to make friends. She stopped going to the library. She went to school, came home, and locked herself in her room. Her mother tried to reach her, leaving meals outside her door, talking to her through the wood. But Clara was a ghost. The only place she went was the study. She had gathered every piece of the broken rifle, every splinter of wood, every twisted bit of metal, and placed them in a wooden box her father had made. She would sit for hours, sometimes opening the box and just looking at the wreckage. It was her own private memorial, a tangible reminder of what had been taken. One evening, about 2 weeks after the incident, her mother gently knocked on her door and told her she had a visitor. Clara didn't want to see anyone, but her mother's voice had a strange, urgent quality. Reluctantly, she came downstairs. Standing in the living room was a tall man in the crisp, dark uniform of a Navy SEAL. His posture was ramrod straight, his face weathered and serious. He had kind eyes, though, the color of the sea after a storm. He introduced himself as Master Chief Petty Officer Elias Vance, her father's best friend. The name sparked a distant memory. Her father had often spoken of Elias, of the crazy things they'd done as young men, of the bond they'd forged in service. They had lost touch over the years, and as people do. But her father had always spoken of him with deep respect. "I was out of the country for a while," Elias explained, his voice a low rumble. "Got back and heard about your dad. I'm so sorry, Clara. He was the best man I ever knew." He paused, his eyes searching her face. "Then I heard some other things, about what happened here. Your mother called me." Clara's mother gave her a tearful, apologetic look. She had reached out, desperate for any kind of help for her daughter. Elias looked at Clara, and he didn't see a hollowed-out victim. He saw the daughter of his best friend, a man of immense strength and quiet dignity. And he saw a familiar fire, banked but not extinguished, deep in her eyes. "Can you show me?" he asked gently. Clara didn't ask what he meant. She just turned and led him to the study, to the wooden box. She opened the lid. Elias looked at the shattered remains for a long, silent moment. He reached in and gently picked up a piece of the stock. Running his thumb over the worn, oil-darkened wood, a muscle feathered in his jaw. He set the piece back down with the same reverence one would use for a fallen soldier's dog tags. He knew this rifle. He'd probably cleaned it with her father 100 times. He understood exactly what had been destroyed. When he finally turned to Clara, his eyes were hard, but not with anger at her. It was the focused, dangerous calm of a man who has spent his life assessing threats and planning responses. "Your father saved my life, Clara," he said quietly. "Twice. Once in a firefight and once just by being who he was. I owe him a debt I can never repay." He looked at her and his gaze was unwavering. "But I can start by helping you. Not by getting them in trouble with the law. That's a dead end. But by making sure they never, ever forget what they did. And by making sure you remember who you are." He glanced back at the box. "This is just wood and metal. Like, the legacy isn't in the thing, Clara. It's in you. It's in what he taught you, what your grandfather taught him." He met her eyes again. "Now, are you ready to learn the rest of it?" It was a question that cut through the fog of her grief. It wasn't about revenge, not in the way she had imagined. It was about rebuilding, about reclaiming her own strength, about honoring her father by becoming someone he would be proud of, not just a girl who cowered in a corner while her history was destroyed. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of something other than numbness stirred in her chest. It was a tiny spark of curiosity, a fragile seedling of hope. She looked at this solid, immovable man, a living connection to her father's past, and she gave a small, hesitant nod. Elias Vance moved into the small guest room. His presence changed the atmosphere of the farmhouse. The oppressive silence was replaced by a quiet, purposeful energy. He didn't treat Clara like a victim, and he treated her like a raw recruit with potential. Their days took on a new rhythm. Before dawn, he would wake her. They would run the frozen fields behind the farmhouse, their breath pluming in the cold air. He pushed her, not cruelly, but relentlessly. When her lungs burned and her legs screamed, he would simply say, "Again, your father could run all day. You've got his genes. Move." He taught her hand-to-hand combat techniques in the living room after pushing the furniture aside. And he showed her how to fall without hurting herself, how to use an opponent's momentum against them, where to strike to disable, not just to hurt. "This isn't about fighting dirty," he explained. "It's about survival. It's about making sure you can get home safe." For Clara, each session was a physical conversation with her grief. Every punch thrown was at Derek's smirking face. Every defensive block was against the memory of her own powerlessness. It was exhausting, painful, and strangely, as profoundly healing. The most important lessons, though, were the quiet ones. In the evenings, they would sit by the fireplace and Elias would tell her stories about her father. Not the gentle, nostalgic stories she knew, but stories of him as a young, fierce soldier. Stories of his courage, his loyalty, his quiet competence under fire. He told her about the time her father had carried a wounded comrade through a hail of gunfire, refusing to leave him behind. He told her about the time her father had stood up to a superior officer who was making a reckless decision, risking his own career to save his men. He painted a picture of a man of profound integrity and strength, a man whose gentleness on the farm was a choice, not a weakness. "You see, Clara," Elias said one night, his voice soft in the firelight, "your father was a warrior, but he was also the kindest, most patient man I ever knew. Those two things aren't opposites. True strength isn't about being able to hurt people. It's about having the power to hurt them and choosing not to. It's about having the discipline to be gentle. That's what he had." And that's what he gave to you. Those idiots who broke your rifle, they're not strong. They're just cruel. There's a difference, and you're going to learn it. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Clara began to change. The hollow look in her eyes was replaced by a new focus. Her posture straightened. She no longer walked with her head down. The constant churning knot of fear in her stomach began to loosen. It wasn't that she was no longer afraid of Derek and his friends. It was that the fear was being joined by something else, a quiet, growing confidence in her own ability to handle whatever came. The training was rebuilding her from the inside out. Elias wasn't just teaching her to fight. He was reminding her of the person she had been before the grief and the bullying had tried to bury her. He was reforging the broken pieces into something new. The transformation culminated in a trip to a shooting range an hour outside of town. Elias had arranged it with an old buddy who ran the place. He didn't give her a modern, sleek rifle. He handed her a standard military-issue M4 carbine. It felt alien in her hands at first, all polymer and tactical rails, on a world away from the warm wood and aged steel of her grandfather's rifle. But as Elias guided her through the fundamentals, stance, grip, sight alignment, trigger squeeze, she felt a deep muscle memory connection. The lessons from her father, buried under layers of grief, rose to the surface. Breathe in. Let it out slow. Squeeze. Don't pull. Let the shot surprise you. The first shot cracked the silence of the range, the recoil a solid push against her shoulder. The second was smoother. By the end of the box of ammunition, she was grouping her shots on the target with a consistency that made Elias raise an eyebrow. He didn't praise her excessively. He just gave a short nod of approval, which from him meant more than a trophy. Standing there on the firing line, the smell of gunpowder in the air, Clara felt a profound sense of peace. She was holding a tool of immense power, and she was learning to wield it with precision and control. It wasn't about violence. It was about competence. It was about reclaiming a part of her heritage that the bullies thought they had destroyed. The legacy wasn't in the old rifle. It was in the skill, the discipline, the quiet focus her father had taught her. And now it was being honed into something new. The news of Clara's transformation spread through Millbrook High School like wildfire, a distorted signal from a distant world. It started with small things. And someone saw her getting out of an old pickup truck driven by a severe-looking man with a crew cut. Another kid, whose older brother was in the Marines, recognized the coiled intensity in the way she moved, the way her eyes seemed to scan a room upon entering. The whispers started again, but their tone had changed. The mockery was gone, replaced by a nervous, uncertain curiosity. "Did you see her? She looks different. My dad said there's some kind of military guy living at her farm. I heard he's a Navy SEAL, like a real one." Derek heard the rumors, of course. He dismissed them with a sneer, but a tiny, unwanted seed of doubt was planted. He'd seen her in the hallway, and for a split second their eyes had met. There was no fear in her gaze. It was just a flat, calm assessment, like she was noting his position on a map. It unnerved him more than any glare of hatred would have. And he doubled down on his bravado, laughing loudly with Kyle and Brett, making crude jokes about Swamp Girl and her new boyfriend. But his laughter had a hollow ring to it, even to his own ears. The confrontation, when it came, was not in the dark of night, but in the broad, public light of a Friday afternoon. School had just let out, and the parking lot was a chaotic river of students heading for buses and cars. Clara was walking towards the curb where Elias was waiting in his truck. Derek. Kyle, Brett, and Tiffany were lounging against Derek's SUV, a few dozen yards away. He saw her. He saw the truck. And the rumored presence of the SEAL, a man who represented everything Derek wasn't, real, earned authority, was a direct challenge to his self-appointed throne. His pride wouldn't let him back down. He needed to reassert his dominance, to show that the old rules still applied. He pushed off from the SUV and swaggered towards her, his friends falling into step behind him, their earlier bravado forced. They cut her off before she reached the curb. The flow of students around them seemed to part, creating an invisible circle. People stopped, sensing the voltage in the air. "Well, if it isn't Clara," Derek said, his voice loud, trying to project confidence. "Haven't seen you around much. Been busy playing soldier with your new roommate?" He glanced towards the truck, a sneer on his lips. He couldn't quite make out the figure inside. Clara stopped, or she looked at him. She looked at Kyle, Brett, and Tiffany. There was no flinch, no lowering of her eyes. She simply regarded them, her posture relaxed but utterly still. The silence stretched, unnerving them more than any words could. Derek felt the control of the situation slipping. "What's the matter?" he pushed, his voice a little higher. "Cat got your tongue, or are you just waiting for your bodyguard to come save you?" He took a step closer, getting into her personal space, and a tactic that had always worked before. "Remember that old gun of yours? We should have a bonfire with the rest of that junk." It was the wrong thing to say. A flicker of something, not anger, but a deep, old pain, passed through Clara's eyes. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that same unnerving calm. She didn't step back. Instead, she held his gaze and spoke, her voice low and clear, cutting through the ambient noise of the parking lot. "You came into my home. You destroyed something that wasn't yours. You thought it would break me." She paused, letting the words land. It didn't. Before Derek could formulate a retort, a new voice entered the conversation. It wasn't loud, but it carried with an absolute authority that silenced the entire parking lot. "Is there a problem here?" Master Chief Elias Vance had materialized beside Clara as if from thin air. He hadn't run or shouted. He had simply appeared, a solid, immovable presence in his dark jacket. And he wasn't looking at Derek's friends. His eyes, calm and utterly assessing, were fixed solely on Derek. He stood a full head taller than the boy, and the decades of hard-won experience in his gaze were a force far more intimidating than any physical threat. Derek visibly paled. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The sneer melted from his face. Kyle and Brett took an involuntary step back, suddenly finding their shoes fascinating. Tiffany's mouth was a thin white line. Elias looked at Derek for a long, silent moment. Then his gaze drifted to Kyle, then Brett, then back to Derek. It was a silent inventory, an assessment that made them feel utterly transparent, as if he could see every weakness, every fear, every shameful secret they possessed. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried the weight of a judicial ruling. "You're Derek Thorpe." It wasn't a question. "I've heard a lot about you. About what you did." He took a half step forward, and Derek flinched. Elias stopped, a faint, humorless smile touching his lips. "You see, son, there are two kinds of people in this world. Those who build things, and those who tear them down. Builders earn respect. Tearers, they just show everyone what they're afraid of." He gestured slightly towards Clara. "This young woman's father was a builder. He was a soldier, a man of honor. He built a legacy, piece by piece, and he passed it on to her. You and your friends." His eyes flickered over the others. "You tore apart a symbol of that legacy. You thought it was a game. You thought there wouldn't be any consequences." He let the word hang in the air. "You were wrong." Elias turned his full attention back to Derek. "We're not here to hurt you. That's not how builders operate. But we are here to deliver a message. That message is this: Clara's life is not your playground. Her past is not your punchline. Her home is not your property. You will not speak to her. You will not look at her. You will not come within 100 yards of her. If you do, I will personally ensure that every single person in this town knows exactly what you did that night. I will make sure the story is told to your teachers, your principal, your parents' country club friends, and the admissions offices of every college you've applied to. As I will make sure the world sees you for exactly what you are, a coward who breaks old rifles to feel like a man. The parking lot was utterly silent. Derek's face was a mask of shock, humiliation, and dawning, absolute terror. His parents' reputation, his future, his entire carefully constructed world, it was all balanced on the edge of this man's word. And he knew, with a sickening certainty, that Elias Vance was not bluffing. He looked utterly broken, a puppet with its strings cut. Elias looked at Clara. "Ready to go?" She gave a small nod. He turned and walked with her towards the truck. As they passed the frozen trio, Clara paused for just a fraction of a second and looked directly at Derek. There was no triumph in her eyes, no gloating. There was only a quiet, profound disappointment. She shook her head once, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, as if she was looking at something pitiful and sad. Then she got into the truck and they drove away, leaving Derek Thorpe standing in the middle of the parking lot, surrounded by 100 silent witnesses to his complete and utter defeat. The fallout was immediate and total. Derek's carefully cultivated image dissolved overnight. The students in the parking lot had seen everything. The story of what happened spread with the speed of light, far more effective than any official report. The whispers that now followed Derek through the hallways were not of fear or admiration, but of contempt. But people who had laughed at his jokes now looked through him. His power, which had always been a borrowed thing, granted by the fear of others, was gone. He was just a boy, and a deeply embarrassed one at that. Kyle and Brett, those fair-weather friends, abandoned him instantly, desperate to distance themselves from his tainted status. Tiffany wouldn't even